Wife spat on husband at family dinner. Unaware he owns 90% of their company. She didn't just insult him. She spat on her husband's face at the family dinner table in front of relatives, business partners, and every person who mattered. Eleanor Whitmore thought she had finally broken David once and for all, shaming him publicly, stripping him of dignity before the world. What she never realized, what no one at that table knew, was that the quiet man she spat on owned 90% of the very company she used as her throne. And the reckoning he was preparing would silence every cruel laugh in that room. The Whitmore dining hall shimmered with wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped golden light onto a table long enough to seat 30, its surface polished to a mirror's shine. The smell of roasted duck and imported wine filled the air, but this wasn't a meal. It was theater. To the Whitmores, dinner meant hierarchy. Every seat, every glance, every raised glass was a declaration of status. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, the scarlet silk of her gown flowing like fire across her chair. Diamonds sparkled at her throat, but sharper than any jewel was the look in her eyes. A hunger to dominate, to be admired. She raised her wineglass, smirking. To success, to power, and to the Whitmore name. The guests echoed the toast, some with genuine admiration, most with forced smiles. They knew better than to cross her. Beside her sat David Whitmore, her husband. His navy suit was modest, his silver tie neatly knotted, his posture calm. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man diminished by his wife's brilliance, overshadowed in every room. Eleanor had spent years painting him as such. She often reminded her friends that he was lucky to be married into wealth, lucky she tolerated his silence, lucky she hadn't replaced him already. David set his glass down quietly. His eyes flickered toward Eleanor, then downward again, steady and unreadable. "You're awfully quiet, David." Eleanor's voice carried across the table, sharp and mocking. "Or perhaps you have nothing to say because you've achieved nothing worth saying." Laughter rippled among her allies. Her mother, Evelyn Hartwell, leaned in with satisfaction. "He's always been that way, darling. You can't expect fireworks from ashes." Evelyn's disdain wasn't new. She had never approved of David, the quiet man with no pedigree. David dabbed the corner of his mouth with his napkin. "Sometimes," he said softly, "a man speaks loudest when he says nothing at all." The words drew silence for a moment, just long enough for a flicker of unease to cross Eleanor's face. Then she threw her head back and laughed. Listen to him waxing poetic as if silence can buy respect. She leaned closer, her voice dripping venom. "Respect is bought with control, David, something you'll never have." And then, without warning, she spat. Red wine splashed against his cheek, sliding down his suit in a crimson streak. Gasps echoed like cracks of thunder. Guests froze, eyes wide. David didn't flinch. He lifted his napkin and wiped the stain with unhurried calm. His gaze rose, locking with Eleanor's, steady, patient, almost dangerous. The room trembled under a silence no one understood. But David understood, and he knew Eleanor's reign had just written its own ending. The wine still glistened on David's lapel, but the silence it birthed weighed heavier than any stain. Forks hovered midair. Conversations strangled into awkward coughs. Even the chandeliers above seemed to dim, as though the house itself recoiled from Eleanor's contempt. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, smirking at the frozen room. "There," she said lightly, twirling her glass. "Now he looks the way he lives, stained, silent, invisible." Laughter bubbled nervously from her brother, Charles Hartwell, who quickly covered it with a sip of wine. The others glanced between David and Eleanor, torn between fear of her dominance and pity for him. David pressed the napkin slowly against his cheek, every movement deliberate. His composure unsettled them more than if he had shouted. His calm was not submission, it was calculation, the kind a hunter wears when the prey thinks it has escaped. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice steady as stone, "in every family there are moments that are remembered for generations. This one will be yours." His words, quiet though they were, crawled across the table like smoke. A few guests shifted uneasily. Evelyn Hartwell's lips tightened. She read something in his tone she didn't like, though she quickly disguised it behind a cold smile. "Don't try to sound wise, David," Evelyn said crisply. "You've never led this family. You never will. My daughter is the face of Whitmore Holdings. She carries the name with strength, not silence." David's gaze flickered to her, then back to Eleanor. He didn't answer. His silence was his shield and his sword. Clara Monroe, Eleanor's closest friend, leaned forward from 2 seats away. Her honey blonde hair framed a face that tried to look sympathetic, but hid restless curiosity. "David, you must understand," she said softly. "Eleanor carries burdens you can't, the company, the reputation, she does it all alone." Eleanor smiled at Clara approvingly, but Clara's eyes lingered a fraction longer on David. There was something in his stillness that fascinated her, though she pushed it away. A flash of memory burned in David's mind as he dabbed the last of the stain. 5 years ago, in that very room, Eleanor had boasted to her circle, "David was lucky I chose him. Without me, he'd still be teaching night classes at that second-rate university." They had laughed then, too. But what no one knew, what Eleanor never cared to ask, was that his second-rate work had been the architecture of something far greater than she imagined. "See?" Eleanor spread her arms now, inviting the table's approval.
"He can't even defend himself."
"This is why I say he's useless," one of the younger cousins whispered too loudly. "If he's useless, why keep him?" The question cut sharper than Eleanor expected. Her jaw tensed before she forced a laugh. "Because even a dog makes a house look whole," she sneered. David's eyes flicked to the boy who had asked it, then back to Eleanor. He said nothing. But inside, the silence thundered. Eleanor thought she had won again. She didn't see the way the servants moved nervously around David, lowering their eyes with something like respect. She didn't hear the way 2 business partners whispered to each other, one muttering, "Strange. The staff obey him more than her." She didn't notice the cracks forming beneath the marble floor of her power. The dinner resumed with forced laughter and brittle chatter. But for the first time, unease rippled through the hall. It wasn't Eleanor's cruelty that haunted them, it was David's calm. And deep inside Eleanor, though she would never admit it, a sliver of fear took root. The clinking of silverware tried to resurrect the dinner, but the damage was done. Guests murmured in fragments, each word careful, as though the air itself might shatter. Eleanor thrived in that unease. To her, silence was submission, and every lowered gaze was proof of her supremacy. She leaned toward her mother, Evelyn, her diamond earring brushing against her cheek as she whispered, "Do you see what I mean? He's dead weight. He should be grateful I let him sit at this table." Evelyn's sharp eyes, polished by decades of wielding social power, softened only for her daughter. "You carried this family on your back, Eleanor. David should thank you every morning for tolerating him." Across the table, David's fork paused for half a beat. The words struck, but they didn't pierce. He had grown used to their script. His silence framed as weakness, her cruelty disguised as strength. He set the fork down gently, folding his hands, his expression unreadable. Clara Monroe, sipping her champagne, tilted her head. "Eleanor, perhaps you're being too harsh," she said with a careful smile. "David may not speak much, but he has presence." Her words hung oddly in the air, as though even she wasn't sure why she said them. Eleanor chuckled, dismissive. "Presence? A shadow has presence, Clara. Shall I build a company with that?" David's gaze slid briefly to Clara. Her cheeks flushed, though she quickly looked down. She told herself it was sympathy, nothing more, but her pulse said otherwise. For David, Eleanor's laughter tugged at an old memory. He was 30, standing in a small, windowless office, chalk dust clinging to his sleeves. He had been a lecturer then, quiet but brilliant, his nights spent drafting plans for a logistics model that could transform Whitmore Holdings. When he shared it with Eleanor, she had laughed. "You're adorable," she had said, "but men like you dream while men like me build. Leave the empire to me." She never knew that her father, impressed by the draft, had invited David into private meetings. Quiet ones where signatures were exchanged, stakes purchased, and debts covered in David's name. Her father had seen what she never bothered to look for. "Darling," Eleanor cooed now, loud enough for the table to hear, "tell everyone again how you spent last quarter. Reading books? Playing chess with yourself? While the rest of us sealed deals?" Nervous laughter trickled. Someone muttered, "Cruel." David's eyes lifted, calm and steady. "Books teach what arrogance hides," he said softly. The remark landed with more weight than volume. A hush passed through the table. Eleanor's smile faltered, just briefly, but she recovered with a dramatic sip of wine. "See? This is why no one takes him seriously. He hides behind riddles." Her brother Charles smirked. "A man afraid of his own voice," he added. David turned his attention back to his plate, unfazed. But in his mind, another flash of memory surfaced. Eleanor screaming at him 2 years ago in their penthouse suite. "You'll never be more than the man who married me. Remember that." He had said nothing then either. But that same night, the transfer papers for another block of Whitmore shares had landed quietly in his safe. The dinner buzzed again, shallow and forced, but some eyes kept drifting toward David. His silence wasn't empty anymore. It carried weight, like a storm gathering just past the horizon. The dinner plates had been cleared, but tension clung to the air like smoke. Conversation limped along in half-hearted murmurs, each guest careful not to ignite Eleanor's temper. Evelyn Hartwell seized the lull. Her voice, calm but razor-sharp, cut through the room. "Let us be honest," she said, her fingers tapping lightly against her glass. "Our family has survived because we are led by women with strength. My daughter is one of them." David, her eyes flicked to him like a blade, has always been a supporting character. The table shifted uncomfortably. A few nodded in quiet agreement, but most avoided David's eyes. Eleanor smirked, lifting her chin. "Exactly, Mother. I married him because I thought he could keep up. But it's clear he can't. Every empire needs a figurehead. Unfortunately, mine came pre-packaged with dead weight." Charles chuckled, swirling his wine. "At least he dresses well, though silence does make a poor business strategy." David sat motionless, his hand resting against the stem of his glass. He looked neither wounded nor defensive. He simply absorbed their words, letting them fall like stones into an ocean too deep to measure. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice lowering into something that carried the weight of years. "David, men like you are better seen, not heard. You provide stability, yes, but don't mistake that for power. Power has never belonged to you. It belongs to Eleanor. It belongs to us." Her declaration drew approving nods from the women seated along the right side of the table. Cousins, aunts, wives of shareholders. Eleanor's loyal court. They had grown used to her dominance, their fortunes tied to hers. Clara sipped from her glass, eyes flitting toward David. Something in Evelyn's tone unsettled her. She knew Evelyn's words were cruel, yet David's silence seemed to contradict them. He didn't look like a man defeated. He looked patient. David's eyes lingered briefly on Evelyn, then shifted back to Eleanor. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost too calm. "Every throne has its cracks. Sometimes they're hidden, sometimes they're ignored. But they're always there." The words unsettled the room. Charles frowned. Evelyn stiffened, though she covered it quickly with a dismissive laugh. "You speak in riddles again. That's your curse, David. You mistake cryptic words for wisdom." But David's remark wasn't a riddle, it was a foreshadowing. A memory flickered behind his eyes. Evelyn in her prime, clutching pearls as her husband, Eleanor's father, struggled to keep Whitmore Holdings afloat during a financial storm. David had been the one to quietly negotiate with creditors, his signatures tucked away in sealed contracts. Evelyn had never known. Eleanor had never cared to ask. They believed their empire had survived by sheer Hartwell grit. The truth sat quietly across from them now, wiping Eleanor's spit from his suit. "Shall we change the subject?" Eleanor said finally, her smile too bright, too sharp. "Mother, you've made your point. Let's not bore our guests with David's delusions." The laughter that followed was thin, forced. Yet beneath the clinking glasses and shallow chatter, unease threaded itself into the room. A seed had been planted. David's calm words carried weight, and weight had a way of cracking stone. The dining hall emptied slowly, the echoes of laughter and whispered gossip trailing into the marble corridors. Eleanor swept out first, crimson gown trailing behind her like a banner of victory. Evelyn followed close, whispering praises into her daughter's ear, their laughter slicing through the silence. Charles lingered just long enough to smirk at David before disappearing into the night. Soon the mansion grew still. Only the low hum of the chandeliers remained, vibrating faintly like a heartbeat. David sat alone at the far end of the massive table, his glass half full, the stain on his lapel still damp. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The insult replayed, not in Eleanor's laughter, but in the faces of the guests. Every widened eye, every averted glance, every nervous chuckle. Shame should have burned him, but what settled in his chest wasn't shame. It was clarity. He rose quietly, napkin in hand, and walked the long corridor toward his study. The mansion seemed colder at night, its walls heavy with portraits of Hartwell ancestors, all painted to look more powerful than they truly were. He paused at one portrait, Eleanor's father. The old man's stern gaze looked down, judging, perhaps warning. David tilted his head slightly, whispering under his breath, "You knew the truth, didn't you?" They never did. In his study, the world shifted. Gone was the sterile luxury Eleanor curated for appearances. This room was his, dark oak shelves lined with books, ledgers, and documents. A single lamp cast a warm glow across a mahogany desk, cluttered not with trophies but with files. David lowered himself into the leather chair, pulling open the bottom drawer. Inside lay folders bound in neat stacks, their edges worn from use. He took out a thick one marked in bold black ink. Whitmore Holdings, private. His fingers traced the contracts, share transfers, debt settlements, board approvals. Every page bore his signature, his quiet lifeline woven through the company like invisible thread. 90%. Quietly accumulated through years of patience and sacrifice. Eleanor wore the crown, but David held the throne. A memory flickered 10 years ago, sitting across from Eleanor's father in this very room. The old man's voice was tired, broken by looming bankruptcy. "You're the only one with sense, David," he had said, pushing a pen into his hand. "Eleanor has fire, but fire burns. He paused, studying him. "You build. Don't let the company fall, even if she doesn't see it yet." David remembered the weight of that pen, how it shook slightly in his hand. Not from fear, but from the realization that he was about to carry an empire that would never credit him. He had signed, and that night the foundation of Whitmore Holdings shifted forever. Back in the present, David closed the folder gently, slipping it back into the drawer. He sat for a moment longer, hands folded, eyes steady on the dim lamp. Eleanor thought she had spat on a powerless man. Evelyn thought she had crushed him with words, but the documents said otherwise. And when the time was right, those papers would not just speak. They would roar. The following morning, the Whitmore mansion was awake before the sun. Servants hurried through the marble corridors, polishing silver, arranging flowers, preparing for the luncheon Eleanor had scheduled with her mother's circle of friends. She believed appearances must be maintained, especially after last night's spectacle. David descended the grand staircase in a crisp gray suit, quiet as ever. He moved without the need for an entourage, yet the staff paused when he passed. One maid bowed her head slightly, whispering to another, "He always notices when we're tired. Did you see how he tipped Marcus last week?" Another nodded, lowering her eyes. "He sees everything, more than she ever does." David overheard but gave no sign. He didn't need their loyalty spoken aloud. Their deference was already his. In the breakfast room, Eleanor sat at the head of the smaller dining table, sipping coffee with deliberate elegance. Evelyn perched nearby, her pearls gleaming under the morning light. Clara Monroe, ever present, leaned on the armrest of Eleanor's chair, whispering something that made them laugh. "Good morning," David said softly as he entered. Eleanor didn't look up. "You're early. Strange considering you had nothing to recover from last night." Her words were smooth, but her smirk was sharp. David poured himself coffee, steady and unbothered. "Recovery is for those who fall." Clara's eyes flicked to him, intrigued, though she quickly masked it. Evelyn scoffed. "A clever line won't hide weakness, David. Everyone saw what happened. Do you think the partners will forget the way you sat there, stained and silent?" David stirred his coffee slowly, his reflection dark and calm in the porcelain cup. "Partners remember more than you think," he murmured. A memory tugged at him. Just last month, at a closed-door meeting Eleanor hadn't attended, one of the senior partners had pulled him aside. "Mr. Whitmore," the man had whispered, glancing around nervously. "We know the truth. Your hand steadied this company when it was collapsing. If you ever decide to lead openly, many of us would stand with you." That memory lingered now as he took a sip, his eyes locking with Eleanor's. She tilted her head, suddenly uncomfortable with the quiet confidence in his gaze. To break the silence, Clara chimed in, her voice light. "David, do you ever wish you had a more active role in the company? I mean, Eleanor is..." She hesitated under Eleanor's glare. "Remarkable. But surely you've thought about it." David's lips curved faintly, almost a smile. "Every chess piece has its place, Clara, even the one everyone underestimates." Eleanor laughed, brittle and loud. Listen to him, comparing himself to pawns. At least he knows his worth, but Evelyn frowned. Something in his tone gnawed at her. She had built her life on reading people, and David's patience no longer felt like weakness. It felt like warning. The luncheon preparations began, the clatter of silver trays filling the silence. Yet as Eleanor returned to her chatter, Clara's gaze lingered on David. For the first time she wondered if the man they mocked might not be the pawn, but the quiet king. The luncheon at the Whitmore estate began under the glitter of chandeliers and the hum of string instruments. Eleanor glided through the room like a queen, her crimson gown demanding attention, her laughter filling every corner. Evelyn shadowed her, a matriarchal presence, nodding approvingly as guests fawned over Eleanor's wit and poise. David stood at the edge of the room, speaking quietly with a junior executive who bowed almost too deeply before excusing himself. No one noticed the exchange. No one except Clara. Her sharp eyes caught the way the man seemed almost reverent, as if David carried weight Eleanor never could. Clara's curiosity grew, but she quickly returned to Eleanor's side, where her loyalty, or what remained of it, was expected. By the buffet, Eleanor leaned closer to Charles, her brother, lowering her voice so the crowd could not hear. "I'm moving forward with the Foreman deal," she whispered, her smile fixed as if sharing a joke. Charles arched a brow. "Without the board's approval?" "They don't need to know," Eleanor said. "The construction arm of Whitmore Holdings will be mine to control. The foreman is loyal to me, not David, not the board. With him, I'll push through projects no one else has the courage for. Imagine the profits," Charles smirked. "And if it fails?" Eleanor's eyes glittered. "Then it fails under my name. But if it succeeds, David becomes irrelevant overnight." Her voice carried a reckless confidence that reminded Charles of their father's warnings Eleanor had never listened to. But Charles wasn't about to argue. He liked watching chaos bloom, as long as it didn't touch him. Meanwhile, Clara found herself alone with Evelyn for a moment near the window. "Do you ever worry Eleanor's pride could—" She trailed off, careful. Evelyn's laugh was sharp. "Pride is her strength, Clara. Men like David hide in shadows, but shadows never built empires." Clara nodded, though unease pricked her chest. Her gaze drifted back to David, who was now speaking quietly with two shareholders. They leaned in, listening intently, their faces serious. The moment ended quickly, but it left Clara unsettled. Later, as the luncheon waned, Eleanor pulled Clara aside into a quiet corridor. Her perfume clung heavy in the air, her voice low but fierce. "You're my friend, Clara. I need you. David must be kept small. If you see him talking to anyone, redirect them. Remind them he has no voice in this family." Clara hesitated. "But Eleanor, sometimes the way he carries himself—" Eleanor's grip tightened on her wrist. "Don't be fooled by his calm. He's nothing without me. Promise me you won't let him steal attention." Clara forced a smile. "Of course." But when Eleanor turned away, Clara's eyes lingered on David across the hall. His calmness wasn't weakness. It was gravity. And she was already circling too close. The night after the luncheon, the mansion lay quiet. Eleanor slept soundly in the east wing, her dreams fueled by visions of unchecked power. Evelyn had retired, satisfied that her daughter remained the family's flame. But in the west wing, David sat alone in his study, the desk lamp burning low. A glass of bourbon rested untouched beside a stack of documents. He pulled open the bottom drawer again, retrieving the thick folder marked Whitmore Holdings, Private. He laid it across the desk, flipping through its pages slowly, as though reminding himself of the long road he had walked. 10 years earlier, the empire Eleanor flaunted had been on the brink of collapse. Her father, Harold Hartwell, had sat across from David in this very study, shoulders heavy, voice breaking. "We're drowning," Harold confessed, sliding papers across the desk. "The banks want collateral. Shareholders are abandoning ship. If Eleanor finds out how bad it is, she'll panic and the whole company will burn." David, younger then, still with the humility of a man who believed his worth came from teaching night classes, studied the contracts. "What do you need from me?" Harold's eyes had been tired but sharp. "Your inheritance. The trust your grandfather left you. I know you've kept it quiet. Sign here. Pour it into the company under my name. No one else needs to know." David remembered the hesitation, the weight of silence pressing his chest. His inheritance wasn't vast by Whitmore standards, but carefully invested. It was enough to stabilize a crumbling empire. He had looked Harold in the eye and asked the question that still echoed in his mind. Why me? Because Eleanor has fire, Harold said. But fire burns everything it touches. He paused, leaning closer. You build. You think long. You can save this family even if no one ever gives you the credit. And so David signed. But Harold, bound by respect and guilt, added a clause of his own. Equity, not charity. Every dollar David invested translated into shares. Quietly, legally, hidden in layers of paperwork no one in Eleanor's circle would ever bother to read. Years passed. More crises came. Debt refinanced. Acquisitions teetered. Each time Harold turned to David in secret, and each time David signed. The trust grew thin, but his stake grew thick. 90% by the time Harold's health failed. On his deathbed, Harold gripped David's hand, whispering, "One day she'll learn what you've carried, and it will break her before it frees her." A knock at the door pulled David from the memory. Marcus, the butler, stepped in quietly. His voice was low, respectful. "Sir, the car is ready for tomorrow's board luncheon." David nodded, closing the folder. "Thank you, Marcus." The butler's gaze lingered on him, eyes filled with something Eleanor had never earned from the staff. Respect. "It won't always be her throne," Marcus said softly before slipping out. David sat back, his eyes on the closed folder. The empire Eleanor paraded as her own had been his all along, but he wasn't ready to reveal it, not yet. Timing was everything, and when his silence broke, it would not be in whispers. It would thunder. The Whitmore corporate gala glittered like a crown jewel of the season. The ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel pulsed with golden light, the chandeliers above dripping crystals that reflected onto polished marble floors. Waiters in white gloves floated through the crowd with champagne flutes, while journalists and photographers jostled at the edges, hungry for quotes and glimpses of power. Eleanor Whitmore arrived like a storm. Draped in an emerald gown that hugged her frame and announced her presence from across the hall, she clung to her mother's arm as if Evelyn were the scepter of her reign.
Cameras flashed, capturing her practiced smile.
She basked in it, the queen of Whitmore Holdings, untouchable and adored. David walked a step behind, his black tuxedo immaculate yet understated. No cameras turned toward him, no whispers followed his steps. To most, he was an accessory, an obligatory presence in Eleanor's grand narrative. She preferred it that way. "Smile, David," Eleanor hissed under her breath, flashing another grin for the cameras. "At least pretend to look proud of me." David's lips curved faintly, almost invisible. "I am proud, just not of the performance." Her nails pressed into his wrist as she tightened her grip. "Careful," she whispered. "Even shadows can be erased." Inside, the ballroom swelled with applause as Eleanor took the stage for her speech. Guests pressed closer, shareholders clinking glasses, reporters raising pens. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor began, her voice booming through the speakers. "Tonight we celebrate Whitmore Holdings' relentless pursuit of growth. While others hesitate, we take risks. While others falter, we expand. And while others whisper, we roar." The crowd cheered. Evelyn dabbed the corner of her eye with a handkerchief as though her daughter's words were scripture. Charles smirked from the front row, glass raised. Clara hovered near the stage, her gaze fixed not on Eleanor but on David, standing quietly in the back, hands folded, watching. As Eleanor continued, David drifted toward a cluster of executives near the bar. His presence drew nods, hushed greetings. One leaned in, voice low. "Mr. Whitmore, the Singapore expansion. Are you certain Eleanor should push it?" David's eyes never left the stage. "Patience," he said calmly. "Let her roar. The echo will answer for itself." The executive nodded gravely, the weight of David's words settling deeper than Eleanor's thunderous declarations. On stage, Eleanor concluded with a flourish. "Whitmore Holdings is not just a company, it is a dynasty." "My dynasty," applause thundered. Cameras flashed. Eleanor basked in the glow, convinced she had cemented her legacy. But beneath the noise, subtle currents shifted. Some shareholders whispered uneasily, recalling David's quiet counsel. Staff members exchanged glances, more loyal to the man who noticed their work than the woman who wore their efforts like jewels. Clara felt it most. Watching David in the corner, serene, commanding without a word, she felt the ground tilt beneath her loyalty. Eleanor roared, but David's silence carried gravity. And for the first time, Clara wondered if the dynasty Eleanor flaunted didn't already belong to him. The Whitmore boardroom glistened with glass walls and steel beams, perched high above the city skyline. The long table was filled with directors, shareholders, and senior executives, their murmurs tense with anticipation. At the head sat Eleanor, radiant in a tailored white suit that gleamed like armor. Evelyn occupied the seat to her right, her pearl necklace a badge of authority. Charles lounged lazily nearby, swirling a glass of water as though he owned the air. David sat at the far end. His black suit was plain, his tie simple. To anyone who didn't know better, he looked out of place, silent, sidelined, irrelevant. Eleanor struck the table lightly with her manicured hand. Ladies and gentlemen, today I present the future of Whitmore Holdings. Expansion into Singapore, Dubai, and Berlin. New construction, new ventures, new dominance. We will not just compete, we will conquer. Applause rippled, but unease clung beneath it. One director cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore, the risks, our liquidity. Eleanor cut him off sharply. Spare me the cowardice. Boldness builds empires. My name ensures this company cannot fail. Her words soared, but her eyes flicked toward David, daring him to contradict her. He didn't, not yet. Charles leaned forward with a smirk. And what does our quiet brother-in-law think? Or is he too busy reading his books? Laughter scattered across the table, brittle and forced. Evelyn's lips curled in disdain. David's role is symbolic. He has no real stake in this company. The room grew tense. David rose slowly, pushing back his chair with deliberate calm. His movement silenced the chuckles. Every eye turned toward him as he walked to the center of the table, a leather folder in his hand. His voice was steady, almost soft, but it carried. For years I have let silence be mistaken for weakness. Tonight silence ends. He laid the folder on the table, opening it with precision. Contracts, shareholder certificates, legal documents, all bearing signatures, seals, dates. 90% murmurs erupted like thunder. Faces blanched. One director's hand trembled as he flipped through the pages. These are valid, legally binding. David Whitmore is the majority shareholder. The room exploded. Evelyn slammed her fist on the table. Impossible, lies! Charles sat upright, his smirk evaporating. This has to be doctored. Eleanor's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. You're bluffing, she spat. This is some pathetic attempt to embarrass me. David's eyes locked on hers, calm and unyielding. The company you parade as your empire stands because of me. Every crisis you survived, every acquisition you claimed, it was my inheritance, my sacrifice. You spat on me at our table, Eleanor, thinking you spat on weakness. But tonight you spit on the owner of Whitmore Holdings. Gasps rippled. The weight of the truth crashed into the room. Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. Evelyn's hand shook, pearls rattling against her chest. Charles leaned back, eyes darting, already recalculating where his loyalties might shift. David gathered the papers calmly, sliding them back into the folder. Effective immediately, he said, his voice steel. Eleanor Whitmore is relieved of any executive authority. From this day forward, Whitmore Holdings will be led with vision, not arrogance, with integrity, not spectacle. Silence fell, thick, absolute. The empire had shifted. The dynasty had cracked. And for the first time, Eleanor realized the man she had humiliated had been the king all along. The boardroom sat in stunned silence, the city skyline behind them glowing like a witness to betrayal. For a moment, no one moved. The hum of the air conditioning was louder than breath. Eleanor's chair screeched as she stood abruptly, her hands trembling though she tried to hide it. This is treachery, she cried, her voice breaking. I built this company. I carried it. David has no right. One of the senior directors cut in, his voice firm. Mrs. Whitmore, the documents are clear. Legally, Mr. Whitmore owns 90%. He has every right. Evelyn shot to her feet, pearls rattling against her collarbone. This is nonsense. My daughter, your daughter, another director interrupted, just forced through reckless expansions without approval. If not for these documents, we might have followed her into ruin. We should be thanking Mr. Whitmore. The shift was immediate. Eyes that once clung to Eleanor now turned away. The applause she had basked in hours earlier was gone, replaced by whispers of doubt and betrayal. Charles slammed his glass on the table. You knew about this, didn't you? His eyes cut to David, then back to Eleanor. All these years and you let me follow your lead? You let me defend you thinking you were the heir to father's genius? Eleanor's lips quivered. Charles, save it, he snapped. You dragged me down with you. If David hadn't stopped this expansion madness, we'd all be finished. The betrayal stung sharper than David's revelation. Eleanor looked to her mother for rescue, but Evelyn's face was pale, her composure cracked. For the first time, her words faltered. Eleanor, how could you not see? How could you not know? Eleanor staggered, her gaze darting wildly across the table. Everyone avoided her eyes. Everyone but Clara. Clara rose slowly from her chair, her face torn. Her heart pounded with guilt and longing, the weight of her secret threatening to suffocate her. She had defended Eleanor for years, laughed at David's silence, whispered poison into ears that were already deaf. But tonight she had seen David stand with power that needed no spectacle, and it unsettled her. Eleanor reached for her hand, desperation dripping from her voice. Clara, now you're with me. You've always been with me. Clara's lips parted, but no words came. She looked at Eleanor, then at David. His eyes met hers, steady, unreadable. Something in that gaze pulled the truth from her. I thought you were weak, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. But I was wrong. It's her weakness I've been blind to. Eleanor's hand dropped as if struck. Clara, don't you dare! But Clara stepped back, unable to keep up the facade. Her silence spoke louder than any denial. The room shifted once more. Allies evaporated. Support dissolved. Eleanor stood alone, stripped of her crown, her throne, her court. David closed the folder calmly, his voice low but final. The Empire survives, but your reign ends here. Eleanor collapsed back into her chair, her body rigid, her eyes hollow. For the first time in her life, she had nothing left to say. The boardroom emptied slowly, the shuffle of papers and muted footsteps echoing like a funeral procession. Directors whispered to each other, already aligning behind the new order. Some glanced back at David with respect, others with relief. None spared Eleanor more than a fleeting, pitying look. Evelyn walked out stiffly, her pearls trembling against her chest. For the first time in decades, she had no words of command. Charles stormed off, muttering curses about wasted loyalty. Clara lingered by the door, her hand trembling against the frame. She looked at Eleanor one last time, then turned away, her eyes flicking briefly to David before disappearing down the corridor. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor sat slumped in her chair, her once pristine suit wrinkled, her face pale. The queen stripped of her crown. She stared at David across the polished table, her voice breaking. You planned this. All these years you waited in silence, and you let me humiliate you? David rose, slow and deliberate. He closed the folder, tucking it under his arm as he stepped toward her. His gaze was calm, but his words cut like glass. I didn't let you humiliate me, Eleanor. You humiliated yourself. You mistook silence for weakness, patience for surrender, and you spat on the very man who held your empire together. She flinched at the word spat, the memory of that dinner burning in her chest. David, please, he stopped just short of her chair, his shadow falling across her. You never saw me, Eleanor. You never cared to, and now you'll watch as the company thrives without you. That is my revenge, not anger, not spit, not spectacle. Just truth. Her lips quivered. For once she had no audience, no mother, no allies to echo her cruelty. Just the man she had underestimated until the moment it destroyed her. David turned, walking toward the door. As he passed the long glass wall, the city skyline stretched out beneath him, lights flickering like stars bowing before their new constellation. He paused for a moment, his reflection staring back at him. No longer the silent husband in Eleanor's shadow, but the man who had carried an empire unseen. Behind him, Eleanor whispered brokenly, almost to herself. Without me, there is no Whitmore legacy. David's voice drifted back, steady, final. Without me, there would be no Whitmore at all. He stepped into the corridor, the boardroom doors closing behind him with a heavy click. The mansion that night was quiet when he returned. The staff moved with deference, eyes lowered in respect. Marcus, the butler, met him at the door, offering a simple nod. Sir, he said, his voice low but steady. They finally see what we've always known. David gave no reply. He didn't need to. He climbed the staircase slowly, the weight of years lifting with every step. At the top he paused, glancing down the corridor toward the east wing where Eleanor's chambers lay. For the first time in his life he felt nothing, not anger, not sorrow, not triumph. Just peace, because true revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. True revenge was quiet. It was survival. It was patience, and David Whitmore had been patient long enough.